I am Bryan Caplan. I'm a professor of economics at George Mason University, and I'm the author of The Myth of the Rational Voter, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, and the forthcoming Case Against Education. What liberty means to me is really what philosopher Michael Huemer calls common sense morality. And the idea that the rules of proper conduct that apply to individuals also apply to government. So in the same way that it would be wrong for one individual to go and punch another person or steal from them, it's wrong when governments do that, at least unless there's some really good reason to do otherwise, which I usually don't see. I am an anarchist, but not the crazy kind. The crazy kind of anarchist is someone who says, look, the government should be destroyed right here, right now, and everything will be great. And I just think that's factually wrong. Like any kind of radical change like that leads to disaster. That's the historical fact. But I'm an anarchist in the sense that I think that all the functions of government that we think of as essential could be done privately. The real issue is just transitioning from the world of today to that world in a peaceful and orderly way. Well, in the United States, most police are already privatized. There are more security guards than there are police officers in the United States, last time I checked. And people in the United States are not worried that there's a bunch of armed men walking around shopping malls and businesses because the people that employ them do not want them causing trouble. In fact, people are, of course, much more afraid of the police than they are security guards. The security guards work for a business, so first of all, they don't want to scare people. And second of all, if they did, you know that you have some recourse, whereas the police, really, what are you going to do? Some other examples, in the United States, it is possible and common actually to sign a contract saying that if there's a dispute, you won't go to the government court. Instead, it will be handled by private arbitrators. So in this way, you can avoid the courts. Again, there's a common idea that government must exist to enforce contracts. It's simply not true. There's a lot of contractual enforcement is just done through arbitration. Why bother doing it privately when you could do it through government courts? Because it's quicker, because it's cheaper. So, really the limits of these things come down to, first of all, of course, as long as taxpayers are paying for something, that means that people will often use the product provided at taxpayer expense for free rather than pay for it out of their own pockets. But also, for many of these products, government always maintains a little foothold left. They always keep a little bit of oversight, which means that the product loses a lot of its value. So, for example, you can sign a binding arbitration agreement saying, I will abide by whatever decision the arbitrator makes, and yet it is still possible to get out of that and go to a government court and say, well, sure, but this contract is contrary to public policy, so you should overrule it anyway. So, of course, if you thought that the laws that were being enforced were great, and that no sane person would want to get rid of, would want to escape them, then you can understand this. Because if you really had full-blown binding arbitration, then an enormous amount of regulation can just be avoided. For example, you could go and sign a contract saying, if I ever have a dispute with my employer, then I cannot go to the courts. I just have to go to an arbitrator, and the arbitrator is the brother of the boss, right? And in this way, you could actually, for all practical purposes, deregulate an industry. You could deregulate the labor market, which, of course, as a libertarian, I think would be a great thing. But if you think the regulations are a good idea in the first place, then you could see why people don't want binding arbitration to be really binding. Road building companies, yes. So there are private roads right now. There are some issues with private building of roads. So there's something that economists call the holdout problem. Where in order to build the road, you need to buy every single piece of property in between. Because, of course, under anarchy, there'd be no eminent domain, presumably. But there are a lot of ways that you can get around these problems. There's buying options rather than actually buying property. So that's one way of diffusing the holdout problem. I know at least one economist who claims that when you really look at the legal expense of eminent domain, on balance, you really don't save much money compared to just using other options. So there's that. But private roads exist already. So I think the much harder question is, what do you do with the roads that are around right now? The actual process of privatizing something like that is really hard, and there's no easy answer there. So there are a number of cases that people talk about. So people often talk about medieval Iceland. I'm not an expert in medieval Iceland. Again, to me, even if you come up with examples from hundreds of years ago, they're really not very convincing in the modern world because conditions are so different. I think it's much more fruitful to focus on industries that that exist right now, that people think only the government can run, that actually the government doesn't run entirely right now. So, when people think of, well, you have to have the government run all the police because otherwise there'd be private armies running around fighting with the police. Well, there's more security guards right now than there are police. People don't seem to be worried the security guards are going to start causing any trouble. So they're just doing their job, or like arbitration, or also, so right now, there's a lot of ways in which private organizations make laws and rules. So, you can see this on the internet. So, Facebook decides what the rules of Facebook are. Right, and you might think, well, don't you need a government in order to run that or regulate that? But Facebook decides. They have a goal, which is to create a platform that a lot of people want to use, and so they've created a lot of rules about what you can and can't do. Of course, most of them they're just rules about being able to add someone or to block someone because they're just trying to get a lot of customers. No, they're not. Their goal is not to go and upset anyone or anything else like that. So, that's going to be, mostly focus on things like that. Another example that we really take for granted, but we shouldn't, credit cards, right? So if you just think about, before credit cards, explaining how something like e-commerce would exist. So you're going to be mailing checks to people all over the world, and then they have to wait for the check to clear, and then you get your product. And what would that be like? And won't there be a lot of fraud? Again, credit cards are there, which is a fantastic system for allowing global trade between people who know nothing about each other, except nothing other than that they both have a relationship with the Visa Corporation, right? Or MasterCard or American Express. So just the way that credit cards, resolve issues like fraud. So if you send someone a check and then you don't get the product, what do? Right? You can complain to the bank or something like that, but that's not very effective. But on the other hand, if you go and complain to the credit card company, then you have someone who really wants to resolve the issue because they don't want to go and have fraudulent clients. So it actually is a privilege to be able to have a credit card swiper. If you abuse it, you will lose it. Right? And in this way, people can use a credit card to buy with confidence from a complete stranger in a country they've never heard of. So just thinking about expanding this general principle to a much wider range of behavior and actions and business. To me, that's really the heart of anarchism is the credit card. The credit card really points the way to a brighter future where anyone on earth can go and trade with anyone else with a company standing between them saying, look, you can trust each other because I trust each of you. Well, so Bitcoin has done way better than I ever expected it to as an economist. As an economist, there's a standard view, which normally is right, that people want to use the same currency that other people are already using because it's not convenient. So normally when you go to another country, you change your currency into the currency of that country so that you don't have to deal with going to every person and saying, I have a different currency you usually use. Let's work out a deal for how much this currency is worth. So when I heard about Bitcoin, I thought this is really just like a small country starting up its own currency. That sounds like a real long shot. But it's actually done way better than I thought. So, because I was talking to people who were into it before it was cool, back when it was really, really obscure. And then I saw a bunch of them made a ton of money. I'm like, all right, wow, something that I didn't know. Still, for it to go and make a further step to actually competing with a major currency like the dollar or the euro, that sounds unrealistic. But as a product that has found a niche and done way better than I would have expected, it's been tremendous. So decentralization has a lot of advantages. In the for-profit world of the decentralization, you can really see how great it is because it means there's an entire marketplace open to you, and if you're not happy with what one person's doing or what one business is doing, you take your business elsewhere. Right, so so that's great. In the nonprofit sector, or especially the government sector, it doesn't work nearly as well, but still it's a lot better than centralization. So the main thing is, so if you have competition between for-profits is very different from competition between nonprofits. Just like competition in a class where you receive a grade for a test is different than competition where you don't receive a grade. right? In both cases, there's competition, but competition with incentives works a lot better than competition without incentives. So, when you have local governments competing with each other, if they're all nonprofits, you don't have the same desire of the mayor of a town to go and build up his town because he doesn't actually own the town. He doesn't get 10% of the value of the town. So in the nonprofits, it's much more common to be less entrepreneurial, to be less willing to upset people, right? When it's like, well, why would you want to upset people? Well, often progress requires upsetting some people, right? And in the for-profit world, it is common to do things that upset people because there's so much money to be made from doing it. But in the nonprofit world, on the other hand, much more common to say, well, like it's not like I actually get any benefit out of this anyway. Example I often think about. Mr. Burns on The Simpsons enjoys firing people. He goes, fire that man, Smithers. All right. It's really hard in the real world to find human beings like this. Normal human beings do not like firing other people. It hurts, especially if they're just incompetent rather than bad people. Normally people feel bad about doing it. But still, you see this in the for-profit sector. Why? Because the employer is there thinking, wow, I have a bunch of workers who aren't any good, and I would make a lot of money. I could save a lot of money if I got rid of them. I feel sorry for them, but on the other hand, it's millions of dollars. Which means that in the for-profit sector, people are actually trying to figure out ways to go and save valuable labor, right? Imagine a world where no one ever lost their job, right? It is a world where you have very little progress, and where if this had been going on for a long time, where most people would still work in agriculture, right? So there are many things. Progress in many ways requires people to be upset sometimes, right? And in the nonprofit sector, much more common just to go and say, well, what's in it for me? Why should I go and try to save money? Why should I try to figure out a way to replace some workers with some other workers who are cheaper? As a professor, I'm in the nonprofit sector, and I can say, it's common, not in my department, but all other academic departments in the world. It's very common that there are graduate students who are actually fantastic teachers, and they work for very little money. And then there are full professors who are terrible teachers who are paid a lot. In the for-profit sector, someone would be trying to figure out a way to replace the highly paid bad teachers with the low-paid good teachers. But in the nonprofit sector, this doesn't happen because the person running the department doesn't get a share of that money that they'd be saving. Of course, yes. I've just finished a book called, as a professor, would I get rid of the Department of Education? Of course. In the United States, the Department of Education hardly has anything to do with education anyway, actually. It's almost totally symbolic. Education in the United States is almost all funded at the state and local level. These are just things that people don't understand. Even in the United States, people don't understand them, much less in other countries. I just finished a book called The Case Against Education, where I argue for an end to all government funding for education. So that is actually my ideal world. It's probably a world where I'll be out of a job, but my conscience requires me to say that we are wasting a ton of money on education, and a free market would be better, smaller and better. Well, this one is not so hard as the roads. Privatized system of education means that you have schools where if they can't financially support themselves, they go out of business, and students have to come up with the money to pay for it if they want to go, right? Or of course, they can be charity for poor kids, things like that. But that is the a world without public education is one of the easiest things to visualize. It just means that the small fringe private part of education becomes the whole market, right? And you no longer pay taxes to get education, and it's no longer given out free to everybody, or heavily subsidized, as in the case of college. Well, there's two kinds of education. There's education that you get to be certified for the job market, and there's education for personal enlightenment. I think the internet is fantastic for personal enlightenment. So not just Wikipedia and blogs and MOOCs, but like arguing with people on Facebook, all these things. This is great for personal enlightenment. There's a cornucopia of intellectual pleasure on the internet. When I was a kid, if the internet had been around, I would have said this is so amazing. As I was growing up, I was just so bored, so lonely. But is the internet likely to go and actually displace the current system for job certification? That I don't think so. And this is really the heart of my book. The main thing that I say in the book is that while education is lucrative, The reason is mostly not that you're learning useful job skills in school. The reason is that you are signaling. You are getting a certification that I'm the kind of person who can jump through all the hoops of the educational system. I'm smart enough, I'm hardworking enough, and furthermore, I am conformist enough to submit to this system of authority, and then if you make it out the end, then you look like a really good employee. So as long as the massive government subsidies for the status quo continue, I don't see any real sign that online education is going to outcompete regular education for job certification. And, you think you go to an interview, you say, well, what are your credentials? Well, I don't have any, but I do read a lot of blogs. That just doesn't sound very convincing, right? Well, first of all, anybody can say that, but also it just sounds kind of like you're weird, and why didn't you do it the normal way? So, so I think what you really need actually to shake up the system is at least to start cutting the subsidies. So there's actually a good amount of research on how much the price of education affects the amount that people get. Most of the people doing this research are trying to argue for higher government subsidies so that more people will go. But you can look at this research and say it also implies that if the subsidies were lower, fewer people would go. Right? And again, wouldn't that be disastrous? Well, if people were actually learning a lot of useful job skills in school, then there's a clear downside. But if I'm right, and actually most education is just about jumping through hoops, and when you really learn how to do jobs on the job, then this would be a big improvement. So there's something called credential inflation. Over time, the amount of education that you need to get a job has increased a lot. So right now there are a lot of jobs that you need a college degree for that you only would have needed a high school degree for 60 years ago. And again, it's hard. If you thought of schools just providing definite skills, it would be very hard to understand this. Why go and pay for college skills for a job that only requires high school skills? But if it's about signaling, if it is about jumping through hoops, then the more hoops other people have jumped through, the more you need to jump through in order to show that you are in the top 25% of the pool of workers. What is my stand on open borders? My stand is we should have open borders. What does that mean? A quick version is, unless a person deserves to be in jail, they should be able to go and live and work in any country on earth. So, what about terrorists? Well, terrorists should be in jail. What about murderers? They should be in jail. So, of course, if you're in jail, then you're not free to go and move to any country on earth. You're stuck in whatever jail you're in. But if you don't deserve that, if you're the kind of person who deserves to be walking around freely inside of your country, I say you also deserve to be allowed to walk around freely over the entire world. So, what is the benefit of open borders? The best way of thinking about it, I did a debate called "Let Anyone Take a Job Anywhere." I was arguing in favor of that resolution. The biggest gain from open borders is this: right now, most of the world's labor is trapped in countries where where it's hard for you to take much advantage of your talent. So, it's easy to look at Haiti and say, well, look at those Haitians; they really can't do very much. But if you move one Haitian to Miami, what you can do increases by a factor of 40. A guy who produces $1 a day worth of stuff in Haiti can produce $40 a day worth of stuff in Miami. So it's not primarily about a problem with the people, it is a problem with where they are. You can think about what you could do in Haiti. What is the best job you can do in Haiti? What is the most you can contribute to the global economy in Haiti? Probably not much, because Haiti is screwed up in so many ways. So the main gain of open borders is moving all this valuable labor from places where it is currently accomplishing very little to places where it can accomplish vastly more. What's so great about that? It enriches mankind. How much? There have been a lot of estimates of that. Well, not only there have been a medium number of estimates of this, and a typical estimate is something like, in the long run, open borders would double the production of mankind. We would produce twice as much stuff with the same number of people under open borders simply by reallocating the labor from places where labor produces very little to places where it produces a lot. People generally just think about immigration as benefiting the immigrant, which of course it does, but the immigrant is far from the only person who gains, because there's also this large increase in productivity, right? And a general rule is that if production doubles, almost everyone will be richer as a result of this. So the slogan I like is, this is not trickle-down economics, this is Niagara Falls economics. If there is a giant flood of extra productivity, almost everyone, immigrant and native, will be better off as a result. Well, so they have an argument, and the argument is that countries are the property of the citizens, and therefore they have a right to keep people out, just like I have a right to keep somebody out of my house. And my response to this is, if you really believe that, then you shouldn't be a libertarian at all, because people don't have a right to speak freely in my house. People don't have a right to set up a shop in my house. People don't have a right to go and use drugs in my house. And like all of these things, it's up to me. So if you really believe that countries are the rightful collective property of their citizens, then you should believe in democracy or something along those lines, and not liberty. So what I say is countries are not the collective property of their citizens. There was never any social contract form where everyone in the country agreed to be bound by these rules. At best, what happened is a majority went and voted for it, and everyone had to go along with it. And if we actually were to treat founding a country with a large minority of dissenters as being all rightfully under the rule of the majority, then the case for liberty just evaporates. And you could still favor liberty on pragmatic grounds. And I would say there, just on pragmatic grounds, open borders is a better policy, and because of the large increase in production. But so this is a view that I've actually called anarcho-statism. It's the view I'm an anarchist, and that means that countries should be able to do whatever they want within their borders. No, that's not anarchism. That's really the opposite. I think I actually once I called it anarcho-totalitarianism. There's no limit on what countries can do inside of their borders. It's crazy. Why would you this is the kind of thing no normal person would think it, never mind why a libertarian would think it. A state, so the whole idea of a club is you have unanimous consent. Everyone in the club has agreed to be in the club. Everyone inside of a country is not agreed to be bound by the rules of the country. This is the fundamental criticism of social contract theory that almost every philosopher would accept. Show me the contract. When did it happen? Oh, here's the Constitution. And the Constitution, was that agreed to by everyone? No. Well, then it's not a binding contract. Right? Of course, you can't, if you're building a skyscraper and you need 10,000 workers, you don't go and get 5,001 to sign on and then say, all right, the rest of you, the other 4,999, you're now bound by this. You have to go and do what we say. Right? The whole idea of a contract is you need unanimous consent in order for it to happen. Now, doesn't this mean that it's hard to get a really large group of people together to go and tell everybody what to do contractually? Of course. And that's a good thing. Right? So yes, so in a libertarian society, of course, in a modern society, you can't, a developer can go and buy 1,000 acres and build some homes there and say, if you want to go and live here, you have to abide by our rules. But if you're in a place where you don't start out with a homeowner association, you can't go and say, well, now we're going to have one and everyone has to go by our rules unless everyone signs. And of course, everyone's not going to sign. That's it's hard to get 5 friends to agree on where to go for lunch. So you're not going to get hundreds of people all voluntarily agreeing to join a homeowners association unless it was there at the outset. So, and much more so for a country. Right, well, so there's multiple arguments there. Let's see. So, let's start with the silliest and then work up to the most sensible ones. So, worrying about terrorism. So, statistically, this is one of the smallest problems in the world. It really just comes down to a numeracy, just refusing to go and see that terrorism causes, in the United States, terrorism causes less than 1% of all murders, and murders are less than 1% of all deaths. So it's a problem that is extremely emotionally gripping, but it's not one that we should be really basing policy on. It's just such a small issue that it doesn't make sense to be worrying about it. If someone has a cheap and humane way of reducing terrorism, great. Just like you have a cheap and humane way of reducing murder, great. But for this to be in any way the main thing people are worrying about is just crazy. It's as if someone were, refusing to go outside for fear of being struck by lightning. It's just ridiculous. Now, when you're thinking about the more reasonable complaints, fine, they're not actually terrorists. It's just people that are coming here in order to go and they're going to go and vote for bad policies, so on. So, this is theoretically possible, certainly. The main thing is just to look at what is actually likely to happen. Of course, the first thing is to realize that the citizens that are already in your country are probably pretty bad. So, so you need to actually be saying the immigrants are worse than the people already in your country. So that that's step one. Especially when libertarians talk about this, they often sound like we already have libertarianism right now, and then some Stalinists are going to move in, and wouldn't that be terrible? We're already not that libertarian, and the people who are coming are not Stalinists. So the gap that we're talking about is relatively small. In terms of what the effect's likely to be, so there is a fair amount of research on this. So so in the United States, there are some modest differences in policy views between natives and immigrants. So immigrants tend to be a little bit more economically liberal, a little bit more socially conservative. So as a libertarian, I'm not happy about that, but the difference is not very large. Right? And to say that we're going to go and deprive people of their freedom of movement because of some small risk that they pose to moderately change policy, again, this seems very silly to me. I'm always tempted to say, well, so take a look at millennials. They're very statist. So should we start deporting millennials because they're going to mess up our politics? Like, no, of course not. Well, why? Well, because the cure is far worse than the disease, and that is what I say about keeping out innocent human beings who are searching for a better life. Now, I'd also say, of course, there are plenty of very small tweaks that you can do in order to handle these. So, economists often call these keyhole solutions. So someone has a complaint about a complaint. You could either go and do the heavy-handed solution, or you could say, let's listen to the exact complaint and narrowly tailor a solution to deal with your exact concern. So, if you are concerned, for example, that Muslims are going to come and vote for Sharia, all right, well, there's the heavy-handed solution of saying, fine, no Muslims can come here. There's also the keyhole solution of saying they can come, but they can't vote. Would people want to go to a country if they can't even vote there? Yes, of course. This would still be a fantastic deal. For most of the other complaints about immigration that we have, first I would just say that in general the complaints are either wrong or just greatly exaggerated. But even if you do think that the complaint is serious, still focusing on the exact complaint and narrowly tailoring solutions so you don't go and deprive a lot of innocent people of the very basic liberty to live and work where they want to do is what you should be thinking of. Now, how would I save the environment? So there's two answers. So there's the easy answer of what to do within the framework of current society, right? And there was an economist named Pagoo who had a very simple story about what to do about things like people spewing poison into the air. And what he said is, all right, then you charge people for doing it. Right? And what does that accomplish? Well, it reduces the amount that people do, and you also raise revenue in the process, which means that you can lower or get rid of other taxes. So this way you can go and tax people for doing something that is bad rather than for doing things that are good, which would seem to have some obvious appeal. And again, why allow them to do it all? Well, because the fact of the matter is that if we actually were to go down to zero pollution, it would be a disaster, right? So you say, well, we could have some new technology. Well, we don't have that technology yet, right? So of course, also taxing polluting technologies does provide an incentive to look for other technologies that don't actually cause pollution. But anyway, so within the framework of the current system, rather than having giant phone books full of environmental regulations just to go and charge people for doing things that cause environmental harm, seems like a pretty obvious approach. And I say the only real issue is properly measuring whether something is even causing environmental harm. So things like recycling and so on, I think just make very little sense in general. But now, what can you do about the environment under anarchism? This is one of the hardest questions. And there are a lot of ideas, but ultimately the only one that I think is really compelling just comes down to charity. Right. So right now there's already a lot of environmental charity, and in a world without government, you can direct that charity to doing things like subsidizing low polluting cars, right? Or paying for prizes to come up with non-polluting technologies that are economically viable, things like this. So I'm willing to admit this probably is not as effective a solution to environmental problems as the Pagovian solution, but you don't have the Pagovian solution under anarchism. And I'd say, the case for anarchism would have to rest upon saying there's so many other things to be better that the fact that environmental policy is plausibly going to be somewhat worse is worth living with.